Hey everyone, welcome back to the library. It's time for another Tabletop Tuesday. This week, we are continuing our series on tabletop history. We've explored the origins of board games and card games already, but there's still one major type of game that we haven't explored, and that's the tabletop role-playing game, or TRPG. When most people hear this term, they usually think of Dungeons and Dragons. It's the king of TRPGs with millions of active players and 48 years of history behind it. And that storied history is what we're after today. I've touched on this some in the past, but let's take a closer look at some of the history surrounding not just D&D, but games similar to it like its cousin Warhammer 40k, which is a pretty vastly different kind of game and experience, but has a common ancestry that we'll take a look at now. So where did these games come from? What started their rise to popularity? What do games like D&D, Warhammer, and the Star Wars RPG have in common? The answer is simple. They're games about war. Warhammer 40k and its sibling game, Age of Sigmar, belong specifically to the war game genre. So let's rewind and find out where these games came from and how they brought about a game that so many of us hold dear. War games stretch back as far as military history does. They were originally designed to simulate the strategic elements of upcoming battles and war campaigns that allowed commanders to find ways to achieve victory and gave them some sense of what to expect in certain scenarios. Games like chess can be considered early examples of war games, but how did we get from chess to D&D? In the early 19th century, the Prussian military developed a wargaming system based on a game developed by a civilian noble father and son duo to practice their drills and tactics in a controlled environment. The father, Baron von Reiswitz, was a civilian war counselor to the Prussian court at Breslau. After Prussia defeated France in the Franco-Prussian War, the concept of wargaming spread throughout Europe and the world. Most historians agree that the beginning of what we consider war games began with the publication of a game called Little Wars by none other than H.G. Wells himself. Wells was a pacifist and believed that his game was not only fun to play, but could also serve as a sort of outlet for the aggressive tendencies of professional soldiers. Little Wars introduced the first detailed miniatures made of tin that the players could paint themselves. So you miniature painters can thank Wells for your favorite hobby. The success of Little Wars led to the development of similar games, many of which favored the simulation of naval battles. In 1969, a new publication called Strategy and Tactics magazine, or S&T, began circulation. This magazine introduced a paper and counter war game along with its military history articles that allowed commercialized wargames to spread to more amateur historians and gamers. Some of these individuals included the likes of Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, who would change the world with a game of their own. Avid wargamers, Gary and Dave began to wonder what might happen if they made their own system that included fantasy elements based off of fiction like Conan the Barbarian. In 1974, Dungeons and Dragons was published and spread like wildfire in popularity, bringing the world of wargaming closer to the mainstream. D&D moved away from the focus of army against army and more on a small group of adventurers who just want to explore ruins and get rich quick by robbing monsters of their ill-gotten treasures. The game was also the first to introduce ongoing storylines and continuous adventures with the same characters, as opposed to the individual one-shot campaigns common with wargames. Though D&D strays from the traditional aspects of wargaming, some modern games stayed true to the formula while developing their own systems and adding that flair of fantasy that gamers of the 80s craved. Warhammer, which was published in 1983, did just that. It combined the fantasy inspired by the works of Tolkien and similar authors and the hype from D&D, which, despite public opposition, continued to spread in popularity. However, Warhammer chose to stick to the one-shot style of gaming that took one couple-hour session as opposed to a campaign that might last months or years. The popularity of these two games spawned the modern-day genres of wargaming that we enjoy today. Games like Call of Cthulhu, Pathfinder, Battletech, and Cyberpunk exist in part because of the groundwork laid by D&D and Warhammer, and the success of these titans of the industry can be attributed to Little Wars, a game that teaches us that games like these are not meant to bring out the worst in us, but to instead give us a way to connect, imagine stories that we make up, and just have fun moving little painted toys around a board for a few hours. That's all for today's Tabletop Tuesday. I know this was a long one, but there was so much to cover. Next week, we'll wrap up our Tabletop History series with a look at the legacy of Dungeons and Dragons. Thanks for watching, everyone. We'll see you next time.